Hi guys, today we're going to talk about photosynthesis. So your objectives or the things that I want you to be able to do after this presentation are to explain the processes that a plant uses in photosynthesis, to explain the role of ADP and ATP cycling within the chloroplast of the cell, explain the light reaction, and explain the steps of the Calvin cycle. There are two different types of organisms. The first type of organism is an autotroph. Autotrophs are organisms that use energy from the sun, or they can use energy from chemical bonds in substances to make organic compounds. Examples of these organisms are flowers. These organisms do a process called photosynthesis. Now, I just want to put in a little aside here. Organisms that make energy from chemical bonds in substances instead of light do a process called chemosynthesis. And we're probably going to spend a few minutes talking about that in class, but I just want to make you aware of that. The second type of organism is called a heterotroph. These are organisms that have to get their energy from food instead of getting their energy from the sun. An example of this is people. Now, the type of energy that cells can use is called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. The food that we eat is broken down to give our cells energy. ATP is a molecule that carries energy in its bonds, and this is the type of energy that cells can use. So if you look at the bottom right, I can't use my pointer or else that big ugly bar will pop up. But if you look at the bottom right, you will see a picture of ATP. ATP is made of three things. It's made of adenine, a molecule of ribose sugar, and three phosphate groups. And we're going to talk a little later in this presentation about how ATP is made. Now, let's talk about photosynthesis. Let's just do a quick overview. So, photosynthesis involves the use of light energy to turn water and carbon dioxide into oxygen and glucose. Here's the first bit of information that I'm going to tell you you must memorize. There's no way around it. You have to memorize this equation. So you'll need to memorize it two ways. You'll need to memorize it in words, like at the top, and you'll need to memorize it in chemical symbols, like at the bottom. So I'm going to read it both ways for you now. So carbon dioxide plus water, and then you see this arrow. This arrow says yields. Yields is kind of like the equal sign of science. Okay, so instead of saying carbon dioxide and water equals sugar and oxygen, I'm going to say carbon dioxide and water yields sugar and oxygen. So let me start reading that again for you. Carbon dioxide and water, in the presence of light, you can't forget the light up here, yields sugar and oxygen. Let me read the bottom in the chemical symbols. Now, one thing I will tell you is that you need to know what each of these chemical symbols stands for. So, 6CO2, or 6 carbon dioxide molecules, plus 6H2O, or 6 water molecules, in the presence of light yields C6H12O6, that is glucose. Okay, so C6H12O6 is glucose. So it yields C6H12O6 plus 6 molecules of O2 or oxygen. Okay, so both of those you need to memorize. A good way to memorize them is to practice writing them over and over and over again on paper. Now, before we really get into photosynthesis, we have to talk about light and pigments. Light plays a major role in photosynthesis, and so does a pigment. So, light contains a mixture of wavelengths, and each of the visible wavelengths have a color. Okay, you may have heard before of Roy G. Biv or red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, which is kind of the way that we make rainbows. Okay, that's a way to remember the visible light spectrum colors in order. And there's a picture of it at the bottom of this slide. Now, in addition to water and carbon dioxide and light energy, photosynthesis requires pigment. Chlorophyll is the primary light-absorbing pigment in autotrophs. Chlorophyll is found inside of an organelle called the chloroplast. Remember, there are three things that a plant cell has that an animal cell does not have. And one of those things that a plant cell has is a chloroplast. Animal cells don't have those. So your cells don't have chloroplasts. So thinking about pigments and thinking about light, why are plants green? Well, we've got to kind of put those two principles together. Chlorophyll, the primary pigment involved in photosynthesis, absorbs blue and red wavelengths of light. It reflects green and yellow wavelengths. So, plants are green because green and yellow light is reflected by chlorophyll, and the light that's reflected is the color that you see. We're going to skip that checkpoint. We'll do that together in class. So, now we're going to talk about the anatomy of a chloroplast, or what the inside of a chloroplast looks like. Remember that chloroplasts are only found, chloroplasts are only found in plant cells. So the first part of a chloroplast is the stroma. The stroma is kind of like the jelly stuff inside of a chloroplast. I compare it to the the cytoplasm of the cell. So it's kind of like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. And then we have this stack here called a granum. Now, if we're talking about more than one, then we call them grana. These are a stack of thylakoids. Finally, we're going to talk about what a thylakoid is. So each one of those little discs in that stack is a thylakoid. And thylakoids are disc-shaped structures that hold the pigments necessary for photosynthesis. Just as a reminder, the pigment that we're talking about is chlorophyll, but there are more than one pigment that's used in photosynthesis. One last thing I want to say about the chloroplasts is that chloroplasts have their own DNA, which is really unique because most organelles do not have DNA. Cells do have DNA, but the chloroplast is one of two special organelles that do have their own DNA. So this is an overview of photosynthesis, and we're going to talk about both of these types of reactions. The first reaction we'll talk about is the light-dependent reaction, and then we'll move into the light-independent reaction. So again, there are two stages of photosynthesis. The first stage is the light-dependent reaction, and that is where we get the photo part of photosynthesis. In this part of photosynthesis, energy is captured from the sun and it's transferred to electrons. And then we have the light independent reactions, or the synthesis part, because synthesis means to make, and we're actually making something here. We are taking energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, and we are going to make sugars. So first, let's talk about the light-dependent reactions. In the light-dependent reactions, energy is absorbed from the sun by chlorophyll and by other light-absorbing molecules that can be found in the thylakoid. And we're not going to really talk about them here, but if you want to go and Google them, they're called photosystem 1 and 2, and they're really very interesting molecules. The energy that is absorbed from the sun is transferred to electrons. We're going to hold off on talking about those electrons and mention what happens to the water that's used, and then we'll come back to the electrons. So, one other thing that's used in the light-dependent reaction is water. Water is broken down by enzymes into oxygen gas and hydrogen ions. All right, back to those electrons. Electrons are going to move from protein to protein in the electron transport chain. Those electrons have been excited because they've been given energy from the sun. And so they get really super duper duper happy and they jump from protein to protein. And as they jump, they give each protein a little bit of energy. Their energy is going to be used to move hydrogen against its concentration gradient into the thylakoid. This hydrogen is really important, and in a moment, I'm going to tell you why. I do want to review with you guys a few things that we covered in cell transport. So remember, molecules are going to move automatically from where there's a lot of them to where there's not a lot. And diffusion is going to happen anytime there's a difference in concentration in one place compared to another. So if I have a room and I have 3 students on one side and 2 students on the other, there's a difference in concentration. Okay. And so diffusion could happen in that situation. This is called a concentration gradient. Now, remember I mentioned that hydrogen that is pumped into the thylakoid. Here is where we will talk a little more about that hydrogen. So also in the light-dependent reactions, we're going to make 2 energy molecules. The first kind of energy molecules that we'll make is called ATP. The second is called NADPH. We are not going to talk much about how NADPH is made, but we will talk about how ATP is made. We're going to talk about that right now. So, the equation for how we make ATP is ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. Di means 2. So this molecule has 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. ADP gets an extra phosphate group, which gives or yields ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. ATP has 3 phosphates. So we took the 2 phosphates from adenosine diphosphate, we added 1 phosphate group, and that gave us adenosine triphosphate with 3 phosphates. So here in words is how we make ATP. Those hydrogen ions are going to diffuse through the thylakoid membrane with the concentration gradient. While that hydrogen is flowing through the membrane, it's also going to flow through something called ATP synthase, which is an enzyme that makes ATP, and that's very important to know. So the hydrogen is also going to flow through ATP synthase, which ATP synthase then goes on to make ATP from ADP. Here is a picture that gives an overview of the light reactions of photosynthesis. Now, I'm going to use my pointer as much as I can to go through this picture with you, but there are some areas that I can't use my pointer for. So first we have the light hitting the chlorophyll, which is inside the thylakoid membrane. This is going to cause electrons to get very excited and move along the membrane. This is also going to cause water to split into hydrogen and oxygen. Now, the hydrogen is going to move all around, but the most important movement of hydrogen is over here. The hydrogen is going to move through, it's going to move through ATP synthase, and it's going to make ATP. We're also going to make NADPH. Okay? So that's what happens in the light reactions of photosynthesis. Now, the oxygen that we made is going to go out of the cell and out of the leaf, and it's going to go into the atmosphere, and we breathe it. The ATP and NADPH that we made are going to go into the light independent reactions, where they will combine with carbon dioxide to make glucose. So let's talk a little more about the light independent reactions. These reactions take place in the stroma of the chloroplast. They don't need any sunlight. ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions are going to fuel a series of reactions that are called the Calvin cycle. The carbon dioxide gas from the atmosphere and the ATP and NADPH molecules are going to combine to create glucose. And there's a picture of glucose in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. So again, here's the Calvin cycle. Carbon dioxide is going to react with NADPH and ATP to form glucose. But I do want to point out one very important detail in this picture. As you see, we'll start with ATP. ATP, when it is used, when the energy is all used up, it converts back to ADP. And NADPH, when the energy is all used up from it, converts back to NADP plus. Okay? So just remember that when we use NADPH, it's going to become NADP plus. When we use ATP, it's going to become ADP. I also want you to understand that carbon is the star of the show. These reactions could not happen without something called the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is a set of reactions that occur by carbon based molecules rearranging to form glucose. So let's do an overview of photosynthesis, shall we? In the light dependent reactions, we take light and water and we end up with oxygen. right? We also get ATP and NADPH. ATP and NADPH feed over into the Calvin cycle or the light independent reactions where they combine with carbon dioxide to make sugar. Sometimes photosynthesis does not occur. Let's talk about some of the factors that can affect photosynthesis. The first factor that can affect photosynthesis is the amount of water. Water is one of the raw materials that you need, so any shortage of water can slow or stop photosynthesis. Plants that live in the desert or conifers that live in dry conditions um, have a waxy coating on their leaves to help prevent water loss. Another factor that affects photosynthesis is temperature. Photosynthesis enzymes function best between 0 degrees Celsius and 35 degrees Celsius. At temperatures above or below this range, photosynthesis will slow or stop. Why do you think? Because the enzymes denature. Conifers or Christmas trees in winter may carry out photosynthesis occasionally. So they're not doing photosynthesis very quickly or very often. The final thing that can affect photosynthesis, and we're going to do a lab on this, is light intensity. More light will increase the rate of photosynthesis up to a certain level until that plant reaches its maximum rate of photosynthesis. So, the big picture is that photosynthesis provides the oxygen we need to breathe and the sugars that heterotrophs like us consume to survive. Carbon dioxide plus water in the presence of light yields glucose and oxygen. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you in class. Bye.